Brian Cossiboom.
Hello and good evening, and welcome to our inaugural Forum on Leadership and our very first Studio 43. As Ken mentioned earlier, these Studio 43 conversations are part of our ongoing Transformation and Foundation series, a discussion of forces that will transform our lives over the next 50 years, and reinforcing those concepts that bind us together as citizens. So to that end, this conversation will check both boxes: nature, which is foundational, and conservation, which is transformational. In a few moments, we'll hear from a distinguished group of experts as they discuss this important and timely topic. Our panel today includes James Farmer, the prolific author of several best-selling garden and interior design books. If you watch television, listen to the radio, or read popular magazines like Southern Living, Traditional Home, or Southern Home, you have likely already been exposed to James's Southern grace and charm. Also on our panel today is world-renowned landscape architect Michael van Valkenburg. Michael is certainly no stranger to the Bush Center. Many of you likely enjoyed his handiwork as you arrived today. Michael and his team at Michael van Valkenburg and Associates sculpted the grounds of the Bush Center, which I know you will be hearing a lot more about in a few minutes. Our beautiful grounds sit on an equally lovely campus, so it's very fitting that today's panel will be moderated by SMU's very own Klaus Desmet. Klaus's research focuses on international trade, economic growth, and a topic that will be particularly relevant to today's conversation: urban economics. Many of you may not know that you sit here today in the very first presidential library designed to achieve the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED Platinum designation. This designation would not have been possible without the leadership of the chair of our design committee, Mrs. Laura Bush. Mrs. Bush has been an ardent supporter of conservation for decades. She used her platform as First Lady to visit more than 30 national parks and also served as the honorary co-chair of the National Park Service Centennial. She also practices what she preaches. She's been the visionary behind the wildflower prairie restoration at her Prairie Chapel Ranch outside of Crawford, Texas. It was also very natural then that those efforts transitioned to the Bush Center and the creation of our 15-acre native Texas park. I do hope everyone takes time to enjoy that while they're here today. The wildflowers are in bloom. She's also the founder of Texan by Nature, a nonprofit organization committed to prairie restoration efforts and teaching Texans the importance of conserving our state's natural resources. Before our panelists take the stage, it's my great honor to introduce one of America's most beloved First Ladies, my friend, Mrs. Laura Bush.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much. And thanks to Brian. Brian wears many hats around here, and one of those is making sure the Bush Center looks good every day. So thank you, Brian, for taking care of our building and grounds and for making the Bush Center such an attractive destination for our visitors. I like to look out of the windows up in our offices upstairs and see people walking on the trails that are down here with their I just looked out and I saw a stroller with a baby, and then I see somebody with a dog, and I can see that people are enjoying the grounds. I became a conservationist as a mature little girl growing up in West Texas. I was an only child, and I spent summers with my grandparents in El Paso, watching and helping my Grammy for hours in her garden. If she were alive today, she would be on this panel telling us how to make the most of your backyard spaces, that you too can grow flowers in the center of a stray recycled tire, or keep asparagus, yuccas, ocotillas, and pomegranate trees thriving in the harshest of conditions. In Midland, I learned to love the outdoors from my mother, who, if she weren't reading, could be found outside. Mother was a knowledgeable, self-taught naturalist who remembered the name of nearly every wildflower and was passionate about birds. Her fascination began when I was 10, and she volunteered to be my Girl Scout leader, which involved helping us earn our bird badge. We would sit Indian style with binoculars and wait for birds to swoop down on the prairie mesquite stubble. Each year, thousands of birds flew through Midland, and it was then that I learned that my city sat along a north-south migratory path. Mother became a devoted bird watcher, and as we drove around town together, she would point out the hawks and the painted buntings as they floated by in the sky. The sky in Midland is a flawless dome. The land doesn't pitch or rise, but remains perfectly flat, without buildings or bright lights to obscure the view. For as far back as I can remember, on a particularly spectacular summer night, Mother would gather a blanket, and we would go outside to lie on the ground and gaze up into the sky. And as we laid together up on the hard grass, she would say, "Look up, Laura, look up." And it was then, as a bright-eyed girl, that I began to look up and to look out across vast landscapes and not to miss the beauty around us. Since then, conservation and the protection of our natural world has been a part of my life. I've hiked in a national park with my childhood friends for over the last 30 years. As First Lady, I advocated for the protection of our lands and oceans through the National Park Service and the Marine Debris Initiative. And today I work in conservation through prairie restoration at the Bush Center and at our ranch in Crawford, and through the nonprofit I founded, Texan by Nature. You may not know that the Bush Center sits on a 15-acre native prairie park that celebrates the natural native environment of our home state. George and I worked with Michael Van Valkenburg, who you'll hear from next, to landscape the grounds with the native prairie grasses that once flourished right here in this part of Texas. We planted nearly 930 trees native to Texas, including pecan, Texas redbud, live oak, chickapin oak, Eve's necklace, and rusty blackhaw viburnum. With the assistance of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, we developed a mixture of 5 Texas native grasses for our grass lawn, comprised of buffalo grass, blue grama, Texas grama, curly mesquite, and poverty dropseed. This habiturf is available to plant in your own yard, and you can purchase it at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center or at Douglas King Growers. The Bush Center grounds feature an amphitheater, a mile-long walking trail, a wildflower meadow, and a 252,000-gallon underground cistern that collects all the storm runoff from our building, even from the parking lot, and repurposes it to irrigate our native Texas park. Efforts to develop parks in the hearts of a city like Dallas are increasingly important, as 80% of our nation's population now resides in urban areas. Exposing more urban dwellers to the natural beauty of our country and helping them understand that we all have a part to play in conservation is critical to maintaining the integrity of our unique natural heritage. I like to look out the window of my office here at the Bush Center and see visitors in the Prairie Park discovering the joys of nature right here in the middle of the city. School children come on field trips and enjoy picnic lunches in the amphitheater. Families come to walk their dogs. Parents bring their children for the Texas tradition of an annual photo shoot in the Bluebonnets. And SMU students enjoy tossing a football on the lawn. But we all know many Americans aren't so fortunate and seldom experience nature in their daily lives due to urbanization and our increasingly sedentary lifestyles. Children today spend half as much time outdoors as children did just 20 years ago, yet they spend nearly 8 hours a day looking at a screen. In fact, children spend less time outside than any children in the history of mankind. This has a significant impact on our state's growing obesity rate. We know that by simply taking the nature cure, we can enrich our lives and improve our health in many ways. Last year, Texan by Nature, in a partnership with Houston Methodist Hospital, hosted a symposium focused on the connection between health and nature. We learned that play in nature contributes to the capacity for creativity, problem solving, and emotional and intellectual development. Scientific research showed that being outside in nature can reduce stress, soothe mental health conditions, and combat obesity, and that the most direct route to caring for the environment as an adult is participation in nature activities before the age of 11. And the benefits of nature aren't just for children. The American Public Health Association tells us that people of all ages and abilities enjoy higher levels of health and well-being when they have nature nearby in parks, gardens, greenways, naturalized schoolyards and playgrounds, and natural landscaping around homes and workplaces. We've only just begun to understand the depth of the connection between health and nature through scientific research. But imagine the impact future findings could have, from how we treat illnesses, to how we plan our cities, to how we live and work each day. So I encourage all of you to take the nature cure. By supporting the development of parks in your hometowns, or by planting a native garden in your own backyard, you can ensure a healthier and more beautiful world for our children and grandchildren. Our health, our economy, and our natural heritage depends on it. Now I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As Mrs. Bush so eloquently talked about, our conversation today will be about conservation, and in particular the value of recovering native landscapes. And the way I'm going to organize a little bit our conversation here today is, in the first part, we'll talk about some of the large-scale and the smaller-scale projects that are going on in our cities, and talk about their environmental and ecological value. And then in the second part, I would like to broaden the discussion a little bit and talk about the broader societal and economic benefits of conservation, because I'm convinced that saving our landscapes and introducing these types of environments in urban settings are compatible with sound economic and business principles. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and so I hope in the second part of the conversation to touch on some of these topics. So I'd like to now maybe start talking with Michael van Valkenburg, who, as you all know, is responsible for the beautiful garden that we have here at the Bush Presidential Center. And so could you maybe reveal some of the secrets about this garden? Could you tell us about how you designed it, how you conceived it, and maybe as well, could you say something about how it reflects the Texan landscape?
Well, I think everybody who remembers the presidency of George W. Bush and Mrs. Bush recall that when they came back to Texas and you saw them on television, they looked really relaxed, like they were happy to be here. But even before we were selected, the idea of being selected, and I was just, I'm a guy who grew up in a rural landscape myself, and I remember, obviously, the President and Mrs. Bush were happy to be home, but I also thought there was something about their connection to the landscape that was surrounding them. And I think when Mrs. Bush said that She wanted the grounds of the Presidential Center to be not a setting for the building, but a gift of the Texas landscape to the neighborhood and to the city and the region. She partly wanted to give them a chance to be in that landscape, not just to have a park to use, but a sense of being surrounded with what has historically belonged here. So I don't know if I gave away any secrets, except that the people who were behind the project had a very clear vision that they wanted it to be of Texas, but they wanted to provide the people that came here a very Texas experience by having it be made of not just native plants, but a functioning ecology, a microcosm of the larger Texas landscape.
I see. So I've always, when I visit the Presidential Library and the Presidential Center, I've always been curious about sort of this descending landform at the back of the garden that you have to go down so much. Is there anything special to know about that? Was that done on purpose with a particular objective?
It was a complete accident. So one of the things that's great about the building that the architects did is the building is really quite big, but it's embedded into the topography. So from the front, it actually looks like a kind of big one-story building. It looks bigger in the back. But to do that, we took a lot of soil. We made a very big hole, and for cost for cost-saving measures, but also as a creative possibility, we took that soil and we kind of built it up for sound protection from the interstate, but also to begin to give this sense of containment. But really what we were doing with the landscape going down was creating a microcosm of the draws and the ravines that exist in North Texas. And with that, of course, I wanted, Mrs. Bush was talking about seeing people out there, and I love the sense of release I see in people as they're going down in. They're surrounded entirely with landscape. This gives us microclimates that support the diversity of vegetation that we wanted to have out there, because some plants like a little more sun, some like a little less. And then the other is that the site, for energy reasons, naturally drains from the top behind us to the back, and so the descending topography makes it energy efficient.
Oh, that's actually very interesting. I very much like this idea that it's a microcosm of what you can see in the broader landscape of Texas. It's a wonderful idea, and something I, honestly speaking, did not know, and so thank you for telling us about this. So is there anything, given that you've worked on this in so much detail, is there any part of the park that you like the most, and is there anything that maybe left you a little bit disappointed, or are you completely satisfied with what you did?
I'm not a person that's ever entirely satisfied, so, but I think that's a good edge to have.
Okay.
I love the seep. I love that it's to the right when you go out, and it's a place where so stepping back for a second, of course we do something great by collecting the rainwater and the runoff in that we never use city water here for irrigation when irrigation is needed. We've basically used plants that only in rare occasions need irrigation. But the seep simulates something you find in North Texas as well, which are places where, groundwater is released very slowly through strata of the geology. And so for a short while after every rain, a little bit of water is released, not most of it because we save it for irrigation, but a little bit is released, and then you have it's the only time on this side of the garden that there's any expression of water, which is when stored rainwater is released back into the natural landscape. And you get this great little ecology over there. We planted some cottonwoods and other native trees, but we have maidenhair fern and some plants that only live in Texas in very moist, shady places. So it's a favorite. Disappointments, I'd say the only disappointment was, not surprisingly, some pieces were happier being planted here than others, and it took a little longer for some to fill in and kind of be fulfilling. I don't know if that's fair to be disappointed about, but
yeah, I would call that a learning.
Disappointment
learning
doesn't
curve.
run in fair ways sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. One thing that Mrs. Bush mentioned was the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and I was wondering, did you collaborate with them?
That was an amazing.
Actually achieve this beautiful garden?
Well, that was an amazing experience, and that's an incredible resource. One of the things that, well, first of all, I want to tell you something that is hard to know if you weren't part of it, but we actually built a piece of the landscape off-site and simulated the seeding and the restoration of the landscape a couple of years ahead of time, so that not just the President and Mrs. Bush, but so that everybody could kind of know what we were getting into. I think they also wanted to know that we really knew what we were doing. But I do that a lot with restoration projects where you make a patch and you look at it. The Ladybird people were an incredible part of that for us. And when we made the test, we didn't just do one, we did 3 or 4 different things. I think the coolest thing they did was they had done the research on the turf that Mrs. Bush described a few minutes ago of the 5 native species, and they'd been working with that, and the Presidential Center was the first time it was used extensively in a public site. So that was another thing they brought to the project.
Yes, I had also no idea how technical this seems. The way you describe the soil and how the watering is done, etc. It seems to me that you need to learn a lot about a particular location where you work. It's not something that you can't do the same type of project anywhere. You need to delve into all the details. One other question I had is, of course, when you build a garden, there's choices to be made, and some people may prefer some botanical garden with some exotic plants. And so how do you view the value of the native landscape and the native plants and flowers? Is that something that you feel strongly about, that it's a very good way of actually promoting green spaces?
Oh, I certainly do. I think one of the things that we work towards here, to pick up on one of your key words, this really isn't a collection of native plants. This is a functioning ecology. I don't think it's fair to say that it's a transplanted piece, but that's kind of what we were trying to do, to almost make it seem like this was a pre-existing landscape that the library or the center was built next to. We really weren't anxious that it felt, designed, or that people came here and thought so much about the shapes of the landscape as the experience that it provided.
Okay, now, we've talked about the gardens here at the Bush Presidential Center. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the large-scale urban projects you are currently involved in? Of course, in Dallas, people are very interested in the Trinity River project. What is your vision for that project? And there as well, how do you think to incorporate the natural habitat, and how is that important, for example, as it relates to flood management or flood control?
Mm-hmm. So the public park projects that we've been involved with for close to 30 years have by coincidence, almost always been on the edges of rivers. But it seems like the older I get and the longer we're doing it, they get stranger. Maybe that's a fable of getting older, I don't know. But I'm just going to mention one. In Toronto, we're actually moving and redesigning and naturalizing the mouth of a river that runs through the city that was cut off for all kinds of 20th century engineering logic and put into a channel. And that's a project that I think a number of the things that we've learned here have found application there. But the Trinity is particularly unique and interesting. And I suppose many people in the audience know, but some don't, that to create the levees, the engineer and the designer who made it literally took a river that was over here and chopped it off and put it like, no, Mr. River, you're going to like come over here and you're going to be between the levees. And of course, very soon after the levees were completed, Dallas was saved from a 500-year flood that would have ravaged the city. So it's an amazing, it's fortuitous and amazing. What we're trying to do now is to imagine a way that we can make the floodway more usable. And obviously, you don't collaborate with nature. You don't take hints from nature. You do what you're told to do. Like, it's just like most of our relationship to our moms, or to my mom anyway. You don't do what you're told, there's far worse punishment than what would come from your father. And Mother Nature insists in the Trinity that we really understand what's happening there. Now, what's peculiar about it is that none of the water actually flows naturally. It's entirely regulated through a series of dams and reservoirs upstream, so it's very unusual. I would say, in a nutshell, I could describe our approach as this. The river currently occupies a small and very uncomfortable channel, and it wants to braid, it wants to move back and forth. Water turns over as it moves, and it doesn't do that now, and so it's eating away constantly. So the first thing we're doing is we're tipping back the banks to give the river more flexibility, and then in doing that, we're excavating new oxbows, artificial oxbows, if you will, so that as soon, like we're all aware when there's a big flood event, but actually almost every week there's some up and down of water down there. So these low oxbows, when you go down there, you'll be able to see the water moving around. It's just going to feel so much more appealing than the trench. Then we're taking the soil that we're digging out and we're piling it up to make hills in the floodway that will be above water up to the 10 or the 15-year storm, which are the most common storms. The very biggest storms, everything will go underwater, but that's the way it is along all the rivers in Texas. You know, that's just another, the trees, you plant the right trees, that's not a problem. And then I'll finish, the levees are very, they're very off-putting when you're on the outside. You can't see in, they're very steep. So in two places where they're steep, we're grading back. We're bringing in a lot of fill so that when you're approaching from the city, and we do it from both sides, so absolutely democratic side to side of the river. It's a sloping, democratic in the sense of the founding of the country. It's very fair-minded in the way that the two sides invite you up. And then you come up and there's a little bridge and you go from the top of one of the landforms to the other, and you can actually go across the whole landscape and either choose to stay up or you can go down and enjoy the river. I know it's a little too long, but...
No, this is actually a little even too short maybe, because I know the audience is very, very interested in this. So how would you envision Dallas side being able to use that space when you say making it more usable, say in about 10 years? what is it that
5 years.
people, or maybe 5 years even, wonderful, what is it that people could expect?
Well, first of all, when we say the word people, it means so many different things. There's so many, like I think as soon as this happens, housing will spring up and people will move there, and sooner than they think they will, they'll have kids and they'll decide they want to stay. And they'll have these parks outside of the levees with playgrounds. And when you have the little guys with their little legs and the strollers and all the time it takes, you'll only probably use the parks that are near the city. But if you're a runner, or I'm a big walker on the weekends, I have that little thing on my phone that I pay too much attention to that tells me how many miles I walk. But I walk at least twice as far on a weekend day. And I think when we say people on the weekend, they will actually take up kind of moving through the whole park. Runners, obviously, and bikers moving faster will be at the scale of the Trinity. The area between the two Calatrava bridges is like 200 acres, which is, it's a lot. It's a fifth of Central Park. That's a very big piece of land. So to use the whole thing, you're moving fast. So I think a park is only good if everybody can find something to do there that they want to do. It's not really a park unless the bird watcher and the basketball player both find what they want to do.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way to put it. And so maybe now it's a good time to bring James Farmer into the conversation. He's one of the leading garden specialists, in addition, of course, to being a great interior designer. And so we've heard some exciting things about large-scale urban projects, but what is it that we as individual citizens can do to sort of achieve some of these goals of bringing back native plants and taking care of our own backyards?
Sure. For me, I have an agrarian background. Farmer's not just a surname. We got the name somehow, doing something. But growing up in a small town in South Georgia, you knew where your food came from. You knew the peaches that you were eating, who grew those, the pecans, so on and so forth. And now that's very chic. It's farm to table. It's a lifestyle. You'll pay a lot of money for that, at a restaurant. However, there is it's a bizarre form of ignorance when someone goes to a restaurant and pays a lot of money for a tomato that's an heirloom, and to not realize that you can grow it yourself, and to have that little bit of knowledge that you can, whether it's a large plot or a small plot, you can grow something that enriches your life any day. The sprig of mint we had in the iced tea at lunch, that was grown somewhere. I always go back to tomatoes in particular because my grandfather, he's a minister, and gardening was always his hobby and pastime. But one of my first memories is him holding me and him reaching and picking the right tomato and the smell of that vine. But the way then that tomato, along with its brothers and sisters that were on the vine, how they sat in a bowl on the kitchen counter, that was beautiful as well. And so that then brought in the interior aspect of it. And my grandmother then told me that we eat with our eyes first. And so here was this small little 10 by 10 plot in the backyard. We live on a big farm now, but that 10 by 10 plot of some okra and tomatoes and some squash brought bounty and food, and it enriched our lives through the summertime. And it was just something that we think of as nostalgic, but at the same time it's obtainable now. And it's kind of chic, too, to know where your food comes from.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I mean, I come from a country, Belgium, where everybody pretty much grows their own vegetables. With us, it was, I think, a little more potatoes than tomatoes. But somehow I kind of didn't inherit that knowledge. And so I now live over here, and I feel that I don't know anything about gardening. I guess I wasn't a good son helping my father. But there's definitely a little bit of a knowledge barrier, and you make it sound very simple. Oh, you know, everybody can do something in their backyard.
Sure.
But I do think there's lots of people who would like to do something, but feel that there's a little bit of a barrier. What would you recommend?
Well, I'd recommend first
like
just knowing a few things right offhand. I fortunately grew up gardening, connected to the land. But what was amazing about that is I had this aha moment. I call it actually a fried chicken moment, but I was in college. And I was frying chicken in the dorm kitchen because naturally that's what every 18-year-old does when they go to college. But I'm frying chicken, and my roommate decided to come eat, and then a couple other folks came over to eat, and I realized that my generation did not realize that you can grow something and you can cook it, or you can sow some zinnia seeds and put them in a mason jar or a silver julep cup, and there's beauty in that. So I had this idea that, you know what, you don't have to wait until you've worked 30 years and retire and start gardening. You can start gardening at any age. And I wanted to be a voice for my generation to say, y'all, you can plant it, you can cut it, you can cook with it. So I just started writing, and being of the generation where social media is a big part of our daily lives, I was able to blog about it. And then Facebook and Instagram allowed me to share that platform. But for me, it went back to a basic of a book. That's how I learned to garden, was one, trial and error, but also to read it in a book. The book says to sow these seeds after the last frost of winter, or to plant this at this particular time, and then the trial and error part. So if I wrote about my experiences with that as a young person, then I could educate and then also entertain my generation in doing that. So I like to take the veil away from gardening as it's something that you have to do in your maturity. Start young and teach your children where it comes from and how you were enriched and enlightened each and every day with what comes from. In the Deep South, you grow flowers in the yard and vegetables in the garden. So I say yard and garden, but if we need a translator, we can bring one in.
Yeah. Very good. So I would actually want to ask the same question that I asked Michael, which is what is your view of sort of more the native part of plants, and maybe even the birds in the garden and the insects in the garden, and what kind of role does that play in your way of thinking?
It plays a huge role, and it actually plays a role in all of our lives. If you had orange juice this morning with your breakfast, or berries with your yogurt, or the fruit we had with our salad at lunch, that was pollinated somehow. And there are bees that do that. There are insects that pollinate. Without those, we would starve. We wouldn't have the food that we eat each and every day. But I'll have to admit, I'm a lazy gardener. I mean, there's already so much to do. It's 110 degrees outside, and you just don't want to do so much of the work. Well, let the work be done for you with the plants. If you know what plants work in your zone, what plants are native, that's a huge help. I love when people say, you know, I'm on the altar guild at my church, and I cut these flowers, and I use them for Sunday, and people say, oh, you tended to the zinnias all summer long. I didn't. I threw them out there, and they did the work. They like heat, they like sun, like a little bit of water. And then I go out and cut them and take them to church. So that makes me look like I've been doing something great all week long, but Sunday morning I just went and cut them. And so that little bit of knowledge is power, in knowing that you can plant something that's native or that thrives in your particular environment, and it does the work for you. And I believe that with pruning as well. When people think, oh, I've planted this, I have to cut it back every day, it's right at my front door. Well, you planted a tree at your front door. You didn't plant a small shrub. And so there's more time, there's more money, there's so much more energy spent in taking care of something that's improperly planted. And so knowing what grows in your zone, what's native to your area, and embracing that makes you look better.
Okay, well, great. Well, I'm going to try to get started. But so what do you say to someone who, you obviously live on a farm and it actually looks very attractive. Maybe we should move there. But what do you tell someone who lives in a sort of more dense urban area, who maybe doesn't have a big backyard or lives in a condo and doesn't really have those possibilities?
Absolutely.
What can that person do?
It's a little rhyme. A pot or a plot, whatever you've got, you can grow something. One of my favorite stories is, and is I was in a town north of here, New York. It's on up there, and I have some good friends who live in the city, and they had me over for dinner, and a lady came up to me, and she was telling me about her garden, and I assumed that she must have a garden outside the city somewhere because she was talking about basil and herbs and a couple of tomatoes, and she had some mint, and she had mint tea every single morning. She was growing that on a balcony in New York, and I was just fascinated by that. So I told her, please share this with the group, and they just could not believe that someone could grow something in such a small area as that. And I like to encourage that knowledge, reading about something, think about what you like, and then embrace it. A little terracotta pot with a few seeds could do wonders, and it's amazingly fulfilling when you plant something and you grow it and you cut it or eat it and get to share it with people.
Wonderful. Now I would like to maybe shift the conversation a little bit and talk about the broader societal and economic benefits of conservation. So I'm going to put on my hat of an economist for a second here, and I'll say a couple of things. There is actually...
You want me to ask you some questions?
I like asking the questions. So what I wanted to emphasize here is that there is actually growing evidence that people, when they decide where they want to live, they're paying more and more attention to what we as economists call urban amenities. And those include, of course, the natural habitat, the natural environment, the green spaces, etc. And because people are paying more and more attention to it, businesses are also paying more attention to it. Why is that? Well, because, of course, businesses go where people want to go, right? Because businesses need people to work for them. And so that growing tendency reflects a change in our economy as well, because if you go back in time, maybe to maybe a century ago, when most of us were farmers, right? Then we didn't necessarily have a choice of where to live, because if you're employed in agriculture, you need to live where the land is fertile and where you can be productive. And even when you think about industrialization in the 19th century, that often happened close to energy sources, maybe where the coal fields were, etc. Nowadays, if you fast forward and you go to the modern economy, which is service-based, it can happen anywhere, right? So you don't need to be located in a particular place in order to be productive. And that implies that now people have more choice. They can kind of go where they want to go. And that means that living in a nice environment becomes a really determining factor of where people will live in the future, and it will be a determining factor of where businesses and employment will go in the future. And that, of course, also means that cities nowadays are competing for jobs, for employment, etc., using those types of factors, right? Using the natural environment, for example, as an attractive feature for businesses to come here. Let me give just one illustration of that. You all know, of course, that Amazon has called for a competition for its second headquarters, right? And if you look at the criteria that it has put forth, one of them is quality of life. And when they talk about quality of life, they actually talk about the natural environment. And why is that? Well, because they very explicitly say that they want to go to a place where people want to live. And again, in the modern economy that is service-based, we have a lot more choice of where we want to live, right? And from that point of view, I would make a strong argument of saying that taking care of our natural environment, improving the green spaces, making our cities more attractive on a number of dimensions actually makes a lot of sense, not just from an environmental or an ecological point of view, which of course also it does, but also from a business or an economics point of view. And so I really believe that, in the next 20, 30 years, cities and urban environments who know or that know how to take care of their natural environment are going to be doing much better and are going to be able to compete for employment and compete for jobs. At least that's kind of my view as an urban economist. And so I would like to maybe, given that I'm the one who gets to ask the questions, let me ask my two panelists here what their views are on that. I mean, Michael, who've worked on so many interesting and exciting large-scale projects, how do you think about the broader societal and economic benefits that these types of projects bring to cities?
Well, I mean, we've certainly learned in like our Brooklyn Bridge project that a part of the Brooklyn waterfront that when we started planning it 20 years ago, people were saying, nobody will come there. Last year, 5 million visitors. Last weekend, it felt like there were 5 million visitors there. The first warm day that we've had. But I want to go one step back from your question, which is why has this sea shift happened? Why is it that in the valuation that people are saying about where they want to live, why have we reached a moment where this is becoming a higher concern? I don't know that I have the answer. I know that it's true, and I think it's because of the emphasis on the general emphasis on quality of life that's so much more, it is somewhat the consequence of our success as a society, but this isn't an American phenomenon. This is something that's going on all around the world that people, and I think it's interesting to think about what has shifted. And we can all think of some things, but it's like we've reached some tipping point. We've reached some tipping point where people have learned that for their life to be meaningful the way they want it to be, they want to have access to that. And it's not, it's across. What's so interesting in Brooklyn Bridge Park, I mean, we have 2.8 million people living in Brooklyn alone in New York City, and when you go there, it's not black and white and brown. It is literally, people from 80 or 100 nations around the world and every possible variation on religious beliefs, all being magnetically drawn to the edge. It's totally true that people want this, and it's interesting as funding for park projects has, begun to dry up, and that's not a reflection on the last year or two, but on the last 5 or 6 years, private philanthropy is tremendously shifting emphasis to putting private dollars into public amenity for the public good. It's interesting. I mean,
I think the Clyde Warren Park here in Dallas is a very good example of that, right? I mean, it was mostly funded by private dollars.
I mean, I've worked on a couple of parks that are being built with public money, and the whole river project in Toronto is a consortium of public money, but most of the parks we're working on are privately funded now from foundations, and really big gifts, really big.
Yeah, that is actually incredible, and I think it's an amazing progression. And I think as an economist, we of course very often focus on jobs and employment, and that's one of the things I was emphasizing here, job creation. But of course, when we think about the more comprehensive well-being of a human being, it's obviously not just related to somebody's salary or her income or her wealth, but it's, living a fulfilling life. And that's why, maybe James, you who've worked so much in these types of micro gardens, could you tell us something about, for example, the psychological or maybe the aesthetic benefits from having a nice garden?
Sure, we crave beauty. It's an innate sense that we long for. I love that a garden reaches all the senses, all the emotions, and by garden, it's not many acres or small areas. It's just that tactile part of something green that does something. Whether it's studies showing how blood pressure is reduced in nursing facilities or hospitals when there are plants or in their gardens. If you're ill and you're looking out the window and you see either concrete blocks or a garden, just the benefits of that. We crave that. We crave beauty. We crave the ability to walk through a door, and whether it's a fern that's beside the door that greets us, that says, welcome home. I feel like what it is for my clients in particular is they want that separation between house and home. House is more structural, home tugs at the heartstrings. And part of that is the plantings, the gardens there in and of itself. So that craving beauty is to me, it's a basic human instinct and of something that we need. And I see that, whether it's your park, if Central Park's your only outlet for the outside, or it's your own 80 acres you live on for yourself. I think the opportunity to create that for people is a true honor, because you're able to translate something that they need, that they're longing for, and you're able to create that separation between house and home.
Yes, that's very inspiring. Let me maybe, we're getting slowly here to the end of our conversation. Maybe I wanted to circle back to something Mrs. Bush mentioned at the beginning here. There's more and more people, of course, living in urban environments, and urbanization and modernization go hand in hand, and this is happening all over the globe. In the next 50 years, the vast majority of humanity is going to live in cities, and not just cities, any city, probably in big cities, right? And so making those big cities livable and enjoyable, I think, is a big responsibility for all of us, and it will improve, I believe, our quality of life, and it will improve our well-being. And so all these efforts, both large scale and small scale, are extremely welcome. And of course, the great work that Mrs. Bush has done to promote some of these ideas in the public space, I think are very much to be applauded, because they're necessary, and I really believe they will become increasingly necessary in the future, again, because more and more people will be living in these urban environments. And as James said, this is what people crave at the end of the day. We don't want to live in hostile environments. It's part of our progress, right? As societies move forward, we want to also enjoy ourselves. We want to go beyond the simple measures of saying we just want to maximize, for example, our income, right? We want to have an environment that is sustainable and welcoming and enjoyable to live in, because, when we have leisure time, for example, we want to go to the park, and some people will want to run and others will want to play, and all of that makes the whole human experience more enjoyable. So I would like to now thank Mrs. Bush and thank our two panelists for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Gentlemen, thank you. I, for one, am inspired, and I am going to head straight home and dig up my backyard, because Michael's already given us a beautiful park here, so I don't have that to contend with. While I'm digging up my backyard, you all are going to move out into the cross hall for reception. I will also note for you that the museum is open, and I know that Mrs. Bush would appreciate it if you'd stop by and see our First Ladies exhibit. It is particularly well done, we think. And then dinner will follow in the American Airlines Pavilion after the reception. Thank you so much for coming.